All right, welcome to my 1-year update of learning Latin. It's been a while since I made a video, but I figure I was pretty close to the 12-month mark in terms of my learning. I had some of the numbers in terms of what month I was at a little bit off earlier, but now I think May 15th was the 1-year anniversary of when I began studying Latin. So now is a great time to talk about what I've learned, what I read, thoughts on learning Latin, and anything else that comes to mind. This might be a slightly longer video perhaps, just because of the amount of things I need to talk about, but I will have some chapter links you can click on to skip around if that's something you want to do. All right, let's get to it. Where am I at in Latin? Now, in terms of total amount of words read, I have read 1,039,558. So that's how many words I read in Latin. So I think I left off about 500,000 words last update. So how did I read 500,000 words in 3 months? Well, we'll take a look at that. So basically, I transitioned to being a little bit more focused on extensive reading rather than nitpicking and breaking down every single sentence that I'm reading. So if I read a sentence and I understand it, great. If I read a sentence and roughly understand it, I'll often just keep on going. If there's a sentence and there's one word I don't know, and if I look that up, it feels like it will improve my comprehension, then I look that up. But otherwise, focus more on pushing forward through books and just reading a lot, rather than trying to painstakingly understand every sentence perfectly, which in language learning is just not an efficient strategy. In general, it's better to err on the side of reading more rather than try to read less, but perfect it essentially. Because you could read every sentence and take a minute to do it, but you're going to go through an incredibly slow amount of reading as a result. And I think that's the main reason why the grammar translation method doesn't really produce people who can read, not because it inherently doesn't do anything in terms of comprehension and getting you through Latin. The main problem is that you'll be reading so little Latin as a result of the method, because you have to read every sentence, break it down, diagram it, think about the grammar, translate it. You're getting through so little Latin every hour. And as a result, you, in a year's time, even if you spend 4 or 5 hours a day on it, you're not actually going to get through very much Latin. Very, very little. That way, you're just not going to progress, and you'll never really develop good reading ability. You'll develop some knowledge of the language, obviously, and have some ability. And when you actually start reading, and you actually start doing extensive reading and not worrying so much about understanding every single sentence, then you will develop that ability, and probably pretty quickly, because you already have so much knowledge of the language. But you actually have to go through that process of actually reading, as opposed to hoping that one day, if you just keep on translating new stuff, eventually you'll develop the skills. Like, someone described reading all of Livy, which is about 500,000 words, as a multi-year process. I saw that on Reddit sometime, which is insane, because let's say it could be like, you could do that in a couple months, right? Like, if you focus on reading 10,000 words a day, which may sound like a lot, but it's not that much. And Livy also has a relatively restrained amount of vocabulary from what I've looked at in terms of vocabulary analysis. But let's say you read 10,000 words a day. Well, you can get through Livy in less than 2 months. So the question is, if it's taking you multiple years to read a few 100,000 words, then yeah, you're never going to develop good reading skills, because you're just not getting through enough Latin. So we have to figure out ways to get through more Latin to get better at reading. That's just the nature of the game. And there are other things we can do, of course. We can listen, and that can improve the amount of Latin we're getting. We can talk with people. That can also improve the amount of Latin we're getting in our ears. But ultimately, when it comes to developing good reading proficiency, we have to figure out a way to get through literally millions of words of reading. Even, again, all of Cicero, all of Livy is just at 1.5 million words approximately. All of classical Latin from earliest writings to 200 AD, that's only 7 million words. It's not that much. Anyone could read that much, like in a relatively reasonable period of time. Again, 10,000 words is 3 million years. You can do it, 3 million years, 3 million words. You could read through all of literature, all of classical Latin in 2 years, hypothetically speaking. Now, obviously, these things, some things are harder than others. Some things might take longer or less time, but these are the numbers we're talking about here. Proficiency is measured in millions of words read, not in terms of how painstakingly you go through each text. This idea that you can squeeze out every little bit of learning when you read Caesar, for example. Well, there's benefit to that. There's value in that. But ultimately, the person who's lazier about it and who just reads a lot more and maybe accepts lower comprehension is going to become a better reader and better speaker and writer and consumer of Latin than someone who is taking their time and going through it very painstakingly carefully. That person will not produce as much learning ability, at least in the long run. Maybe I'll go into more of those details in a bit. All right, so how much I've read? Again, 1,039,558. Let's talk about what I read. So I'm going to go back to the optimized list just because it's a little more organized. Now I went through it and just ticked off the things I read. And there's some things that I've read that are not on this list because I didn't think they were very good, or for whatever reason, I decided not to go with it. So I still have 1,473,000 words to go on my list, but of course this might change. So let's go down. I haven't really changed much of this. I never did read We Are to Go Out of Dens, but I've heard it's good. The only things I really added to the stage 3 beginner and intermediate readers was this collection of reading Narrationes Faciles de Historia Romanorum. Hopefully that was pronounced well. And that is actually a collection of excerpts from textbooks that cover the history of Rome. And basically they'll start with the earliest, like the Trojan War. And what they do is they order things chronologically. So they go through all these textbooks and find all the readings about the Trojan War. And they basically put them one after the other. And so the nice thing about it is that you get the same story multiple times from different authors, different textbook authors at least. And so you get a lot of chances to understand each of these events with sometimes slightly easier language, sometimes harder. And that's the main benefit, I would say. Another main benefit is that it's a ton of reading, 60,000 words. That's huge. That's more than Gallic Wars, I believe. And it's also nice because you don't have to worry so much about like ruining the material. One downside of language learning is that you're reading a lot of text, but your comprehension might not be perfect. And so as a result, you can't really appreciate the literature very much. Now, there's no really getting away around that. In order to read Latin, you have to read a lot of it. And you can't just start off from 100% comprehension. And there's no real way to order material in a way that you'll have perfect comprehension and you'll get to where you want to go in a reasonable time frame. So you have to kind of accept lower comprehension in order to improve at a faster rate, ironically, again, in my opinion. So the nice thing about this is that you get to learn about Roman history, which you probably, if you've gone through my reading list, you probably already have read a bunch of these stories. And you don't have to worry about ruining the text, you just read it. And the way I approached it, I did look up some words, but for the most part, I just read through it. I didn't worry about if I missed some words or certain sentences. I just tried to stick with a nice flow, just read through things at somewhere between 50 and 100 words a minute and just have a nice, good flow to it. And you'd be surprised how much, if you've never done that, if you've never actually sat down and with a text that's not like super easy, like Familia Romana or something like that, like something for beginners, if a lot of these are for beginners, these stories, but if you've never actually just sat down and say, I'm going to read at 100 words per minute, just fluidly without stopping, without even thinking about the grammar, just literally just reading like you would in English. And it might freak you out a little bit. The first emotion I felt was panic. I'm like, oh gosh, I'm not going to understand anything. The words are flying by and I can't understand everything. But if you just keep on doing it, eventually, first of all, even at the very beginning, you'll recognize words. First of all, like et, for example, for and, or in. You'll know those words, obviously, the first time you see them, even without stopping. You'll just know them. And little by little, other words you'll start recognizing, little phrases you'll start recognizing, and then pretty soon you'll be able to read whole sentences and be able to read them just fine. And of course, there's some sentences that are harder than others, but you can't control, even consciously, how much you're understanding. You just have to expose yourself to the amount of input and your brain will figure it out. So if there's a sentence that's just too hard to understand without breaking it down, then just read it, try your best, recognize the words you can, try to get a sense of it, a gist of it, and then keep on going. There will be sentences that you'll understand perfectly, and there will be some sentences that you'll mostly understand. Maybe it's fuzzy. Maybe there'll be sentences you fully understand, but there's just one word you don't know, and you can look that up. Those are the best sentences, in my opinion, to look up, because you'll know that I understand it really, really well. It's just, there's a verb I don't really know. But oftentimes, even then, you can tell roughly what the verb is probably going to be based on the context. You might think, it's probably some kind of verb involving attacking or hitting, and more often than not, that'll be the case. You don't actually even have to look up those words. It's helpful though, but you just have to figure out a way to balance gathering knowledge about the language and getting enough input to actually acquire the language. Because I don't have any studies to prove this, but anecdotally and based on reading other people's anecdotal experiences, it feels like mass input mixed with a little bit of conscious knowledge and conscious study, looking up words, occasionally looking up grammar, maybe memorizing vocabulary, a small amount of that mixed with mass input, that's the optimal recipe for improving quickly. But I can't prove that. I don't have any, there's no scientific studies on that. But the question is, though, how do you balance the two? Because you can go way too far and look up every single word you don't know, which is not efficient. You could try to memorize every single word. You could diagram every single sentence as you go through. So as a result of that, you might gather a lot of knowledge, but because you're not going through the language very quickly, you won't be acquiring very much. So that's no good. But if you don't look up anything, eventually you will learn the language if you just keep on reading. But I think it's less efficient. In my opinion, I feel like you will be improving your ability, but I think a little bit of conscious knowledge will act as a catalyst to speed things up. I think this is especially important closer to the beginning of the process rather than later. If you're an advanced reader, it might actually be more efficient just to read and focus on improving your just raw reading ability, your fluency. But even then, like, I'm a pretty good reader of English, and I found since I've done language learning, I've thought a little bit more about my own ability, and occasionally looking up words and occasionally consciously thinking about what words actually mean, I think has improved my reading ability in English a lot, despite already being very, very good. So I think a balance with emphasis more on mass input, but with a little bit of conscious study, knowledge, thinking is the best balance. But you have to make sure that you don't sacrifice the amount of stuff you're going through for that knowledge gathering, because the knowledge gathering is a small part of the process compared to the rest of it. Long story short, I mostly just read through this pretty fluidly, try not to stop too much, and it was great. A little bit repetitive, often kind of boring to read the exact same story over and over and over again, but I think my reading fluency improved. I never actually read the sequel, but I put it on here anyways, just because, again, it's quite a bit of reading and just a nice use for extensive reading. I will say, though, that textbook Latin, I can't say exactly why it feels weird, but it feels weird compared to native stuff now. It feels like there's something artificial, maybe something a little too clean. And you're always like thinking in your head, like, is this an English thing that has just been translated into Latin that no one actually said? Or is this actually real Latin? That's one thing that's kind of annoying about these translations or written by modern writers, and that I'm always a little like questioning, is this natural or not? And maybe that's just my own thing. Maybe that's just me developing a more sense of when things are Englishy sounding. I'm not sure. But anyways, long story short, I do think that the stage 3 is basically done in terms of the amount of content. Now, people who come after me and learn from this list, I'm sure can tweak it and make it much better. There are probably things in here that aren't that great, and maybe new resources will come out that can replace them. And that goes for stage 2 as well on this list. So it's definitely not like, because you read these, you will get good. There's lots of things you could potentially read, but this is me putting together all the resources that I'm aware of, and there are others as well, roughly organized in terms of difficulty. But it's possible that this list could be improved, this list could be altered, but I think the amount here is sufficient. I don't think you need much more, if any more than this. If anything, it's a little bit too much, but you can't go wrong with too much input. Okay. If anything, I almost wonder if I would have improved my ability if I'd focused less on, I was looking up a ton of words as I went through all these things, and it's possible maybe I would have improved more if I just let go of some of that and just focus on getting through more of it more quickly and just looked up things occasionally. But anyways, I would say this is basically done in terms of content. Now, stage 4 has exploded in terms of content. There's a lot of stuff here. I actually don't know what the total word count is, but it's a lot. So stage 4, of course, is late Latin, medieval Latin, Renaissance Latin, and Neo-Latin. And the logic here is that I would say most people studying Latin, especially hobbyists on the internet, want to get to classical Latin. They want to read classical Latin and read Cicero, Caesar, Ovid, Virgil, all those people. But there's, again, as we've talked about, relatively little amount of classical Latin, and the stuff that's there tends to be pretty challenging, pretty tough. Not all of it, obviously, but it's upper intermediate to lower advanced stuff in general. So my logic is, well, number one, we want to be able to appreciate those things as much as we can when we actually read them. So for example, if I just opened up Livy, just did the first book and just read through the whole thing, I could do that. My guess is it would take a while to eventually sort of click into his style, and a lot of the stuff that I would miss because there would be some fuzziness. And I would learn a tremendous amount going through that, but I wouldn't really be appreciating it as literature or as a piece of history. I would just mostly be using it as a language learning tool. I'm abusing the text as a way to learn Latin. That's what I'm doing. I'm not treating it very respectfully. I'm just going through it as a means to an end of improving my Latin. Whereas I think ultimately we want to appreciate these things. And so the nice thing about reading a lot of late medieval, Renaissance, and Neo-Latin is that just our overall Latin skill will develop just at least a bit more, so that when we get to classical Latin, they'll just have that much more of a base of ability, so it won't feel so much like we have to spend so much time in this fuzzy state of ambiguity until we eventually learn the language really well. That's one thing. Plus, it's also nice to see all the Latin out there, that Latin is not just those 7 million words. There are over 100 million plus words that exist of Latin. So why not learn what's out there? Maybe we'll find that we mostly enjoy Renaissance Latin compared to classical Latin, or medieval Latin versus classical or Renaissance. Or maybe we'll just be really jazzed about Neo-Latin and that's all we care about. Probably not, but it gives us sort of a wider spectrum of the language, and it gives us plenty of opportunity to do a lot of extensive reading for material that's significantly easier than most classical Latin. Because again, it's like you got Eutropius, which is not too bad, Huginius, I think that's how you pronounce it. And then there's like a real step up to Caesar. I guess Nepos is in there too, which they're not like that easy though, is the thing. And then you have Cicero, which, not easy either. And then just, and then everyone's basically, and then it goes up from there. So you're starting from a pretty high level. It's like if you're reading French and you have to start with Victor Hugo, it's like you could do that, but it would be kind of a pain. And so we want to find things that are at least a little bit easier, just to try and smooth the road a little bit. So in terms of I have made some alterations to this list. And so let's talk about them. I'll talk about my experience reading them. So I do think it's important for people to read at least part of the Vulgate, especially if you're at all interested in medieval, basically any Latin whatsoever past when the Vulgate was published, basically, or late Latin and beyond. Because if you're at all interested in reading any of that literally at any time, it would make sense to read the Vulgate first for a variety of reasons. A lot of the vocabulary and phrasing and stuff like that tends to be used a lot in medieval Latin, I've noticed, and they'll often quote scripture, they'll quote the Vulgate, and especially if you're not a Christian, it really, really helps to read these things so that you recognize them and you recognize the ideas being talked about, so that it gives you a leg up. Plus, it not always, but often is easier than other bits of writing. There's definitely parts in the Vulgate that I find quite challenging, tons of vocabulary and that I don't know, phrasing that I'm a little confused on, and also the ideas can be challenging, that the ideas of Christianity and stuff in the Old Testament, like some of the ideas that are discussed require, they're challenging often, and not all of them are super easy. So it's a mixed bag in terms of the difficulty. So just because if this is first doesn't mean necessarily it'll be super easy. Now, in terms of things that I included here, I included all of Genesis and the first 20 books of Exodus. And the reason is that Genesis and Exodus, they're probably one of the most important parts of the Old Testament. I stopped at 20 though, because 20 is just when they leave, I guess, the desert, or it's after leaving Egypt and after the parting of the Red Seas. And then there's just some stuff that happens after the 10 Commandments, I believe. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that happens. And to be honest, I forget exactly. But I would say for most people who are not like reading the Vulgate for the explicit purpose of reading the Vulgate, my guess is that you'll find the stuff after the 20 books, 20 chapters, I guess, not that interesting and kind of annoying to read. And that was my experience. So I think stopping at reading all of Genesis and the first 20 chapters of Exodus gives you a good foundation for the stuff that will be referenced and talked about in later stuff, in my opinion. From what I've read, I think having read Genesis and a bit of Exodus, that's good for the Old Testament. I'm not saying that there's not other stories to read, and I'm sure there are, but I think if you read Epitome Historiae Sacrae from the previous stage, and you've read these first two books of the Old Testament, unless you're explicitly motivated to read the Vulgate, then I would say that's good enough. I also think it's very important to read the 4 books of the New Testament, or the 4 Gospels rather. But anyways, I think they're important. They're referenced a ton in medieval Latin, and and Renaissance Latin, so you might as well read them. They're not that hard, although there are parts that are challenging, and there's a lot of repetition, so you'll get used to a lot of the vocabulary, and a lot of the vocabulary in the Gospels is used a lot in medieval Latin, so it's useful there. So I would definitely recommend them. So again, it's kind of like homework. Again, if you're not like super jazzed about Christianity or Christian writers, I think it's worth the time. It's not that much. It's something like 80,000 words. Yeah, it's kind of 80, 90,000 words. Yeah, perhaps if you're not super jazzed about it, maybe it would feel kind of annoying, but if you're at all interested in medieval Latin or stuff beyond that, I think it's worth your time. Because again, if someone's referencing a famous quote from the New Testament, most of the time I can recognize it because I read this stuff. And if you haven't, it's just another layer of difficulty trying to understand the culture. So, if you are Christian and are interested in this stuff, read as much of the Vulgate as you can, I would say, because it's emotionally important to you, and intellectually important to you. So you might as well read as much of that as you can, improve your reading as much as you can, and then move on to other things or not. Now, another thing I'll mention, before I talked a lot about primers, readers of medieval Latin. So there's a primer of medieval Latin, Beeson, there's Harrington, and there's another one, I believe. But I've come to realize that I think that's not a great strategy for people who aren't already pretty good readers. And the main reason is that in a reader, you're jumping between authors quite a lot. You might read 1,000 words from one author, and then 1,000 words from another, or 500 words from this one, and so on and so on. And the problem with that is that you never really get used to the vocabulary and the writing style of each individual author. And that makes it very challenging because one of the hardest things about language learning is getting used to people's style and specific vocabulary to the specific topics. So if you're jumping from what it's like to be a monk in a monastery straight to something talking about how people measure time historically, or jumping to a story about something else, it's too much jumping. It's too challenging because you never get a chance to get used to any particular author. And sticking with a specific author for 10, 20, 30,000 words, I think is way more beneficial than reading 30 authors of 1,000 words, because people tend to repeat themselves. They have certain phrases they like, certain ways of expressing ideas. And the more you stick with an author, first, you tend to make more progress, at least in my opinion. That being said, I did include the first 42 chapters of a primer of medieval Latin as recommended reading because they're specifically chosen by Beeson to be relatively easy and just to get used to the medievalisms of the time, of how people write it. And some of the stories in these chapters, these 42 chapters, are actually part of larger collections that are included in this list. So I would definitely recommend these first 20,000 words of Beeson, and then probably save the rest for when you're already pretty advanced so that you can read through it and it won't be as much of a struggle to get through some of them because you'll already be pretty good, and it won't be that much of a big a deal if you don't get a chance to get used to someone's writing style. And it will give you a sense of all the different writers out there, and then if you want to deep dive into the specific writer, then these are nice selections to give you a sense of that and give you a little taste. But in terms of someone like at my reading level, I don't think it's worth it to read through all of it. I did read through all of Beeson, but I don't recommend it for most people, in my opinion. And another good one is Gesta Romanorum. Gesta Romanorum. I don't know if that's pronounced right. And that is the deeds of the Romans. Ironically, not really that much about the Romans, although there are some stories about Romans in there. And those are basically a huge collection of stories that were very popular in the Middle Ages, kind of morality tales. And every story, there's like a story, and then there's sort of a Christian moralization of it or explanation to make sense of what the moral is. And it's always funny to read sometimes these explanations because it's like, okay, so this character is Jesus, this character is supposed to be the Lord, this one is a sinner, and they do that for every story. And it's always funny to read the story. I'm like, oh, this is a strange, bizarre story. And then I'm like, how are they going to interpret this as a moral message? And I don't mean that disrespectfully in terms of Christianity. It's just interesting to see medieval writers trying to create a moral and a Christian allegory from every single story, which clearly are not all necessarily from Christian writers, but it was just interesting to see that. And sometimes the story itself would be pretty easy, but the moralization lesson after the sermon would be quite a bit challenging. And then sometimes it'd be the opposite. Sometimes the Christian version of it or the moral of it would be pretty easy, but then the story itself would be hard. This is definitely one where I mostly just read through. I didn't look up much. And the main reason is that it's very hard to look up some of these things because it uses medieval spelling for the most part. And so it's not going to show up necessarily all the time on Wiktionary. There are some ones that you can use. There are different dictionaries that will bring some of this stuff up, but it's just a bigger pain to look up a lot of this stuff. And especially if it's technically bad grammar or not, it can be annoying. So it's a really good way of just getting used to the idea of extensive reading, not worrying if you understand anything. And you'd be surprised how much Latin you can read if you don't care how much you're understanding, which I know sounds crazy. But you'd be surprised to know how much you can start learning and how much you can start understanding if you don't care how much you're understanding. And that's sort of the other side of the coin. If you just don't care how much you're understanding and just try to go with the flow, have sort of a Zen feel to it, just try to not worry so much, just relax, think about what you're reading, let it just fly by. And again, you'd be surprised how it's possible to actually get into a groove and start understanding quite a lot more than you might think. And again, this is a pretty long collection, over 100,000 words. So in order to get through that in a reasonable time frame, you kind of have to read it extensively. Otherwise, you'll spend a year or more trying to painstakingly go through it. And I thought it was a lot of fun. I really liked it and definitely recommend it. Some of the stories in a primer medieval Latin are actually in Gesta Romanorum. And related to that, Byland Abbey ghost stories are also sort of interesting medieval tales about ghosts and stuff. I found them pretty challenging, mostly because I didn't look up a lot of words. I just kind of read through it. But I put them next to each other because they're very, very medievally. Now, another one of medieval Latin, it's a very, very popular one. I think there are multiple versions of this, but this one's about 10,000 words, is Historia Apollonii Regis Tyri, which is a great story. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of like a novella length. It's a very weird story. There's romance, there's kings and queens, there's incest, there's prostitutes, there's pirates. It's kind of got a little bit of everything. There's twists and turns. It's quite the story, and not that hard even. Yep, there's definitely some vocabulary you'd want to look up and stuff, but it is a very, very good read. Now, so I definitely recommend it. It's definitely one of my most enjoyable reads I've done so far. Another great one is Historia Brittonum, which is a history of Britain. And this one is also great. It's actually relatively easy, relatively few words that it uses to express its ideas. 100% recommend reading this. It's great. I flew through it. I read it in one day. There's some poetry at the very end. It's like poetry at the very end that I found hard. But all the prose, though, I just flew through it, and obviously didn't understand everything 100% perfectly, but pretty high level. Also, related to that, as I'm not sure which of these works I started using it, but I've been using my Kindle as a way to read through all these texts now. And basically what I do is I just find the text somewhere and copy it to a text file, and then I use the program Calibre, Calibre, I believe, to convert it to an ebook. And then I just send that to my Kindle and then I read it. And the nice thing is I also bought a dictionary off of Amazon that allows you to tap on the words and it looks up the definition for you. Now, it's not perfect. I'll show you the dictionary right now, which one it is. All right, so this is the dictionary that I've been using. It's called the A Digital Latin Dictionary for Students. It's definitely not perfect, and it doesn't have every single word out there. And sometimes if there's alternative spellings, which you'll often see in stuff after late Latin, like in medieval Latin especially, but in Renaissance Latin as well, I've noticed. So if it has non-standard spelling, it's not going to recognize it. But it's a relatively minor issue, and it does a pretty good job, again, especially for standard classical vocabulary. And obviously it doesn't tell you like what inflection it is or anything like that. But if you're at roughly where I am, that won't be a huge issue. So you don't have to worry about that. It's usually just recognizing what the root word is the issue sometimes. And it's great. And even if you aren't words that aren't in the dictionary, that's not necessarily a problem, because sometimes that's good. It means that you're not looking up as much and you can just focus on reading fluently and develop your skills that way. So again, using a combination of this dictionary and my Kindle, it's actually super pleasant to read compared to what I was doing before, which was using PDFs on my computer, and I would have like Wiktionary as a separate window, and I would go back and forth and look up words and stuff. A huge pain, not great for eye strain. It's like you're staring at screens all day. It's no good. So I highly recommend getting a Kindle. I think this year I'm not sure when it came out, but this is a paperweight, which I got a couple years ago. But I think now, the reason I got it was mostly because it had 300 dots per inch, or that was the DPI, so that the text wouldn't be too fuzzy on the screen. 300 is pretty close to standard text for, I think, on like a printed page. or close enough at least. But I think like you don't actually have to get the paperweight anymore. The standard Kindle, the newest one that's available, I think has 300 dpi. It just doesn't have like waterproofing among other things. So you don't really even need the paperweight anymore, as long as it has enough density so that it is easy to read. Again, it's about $100 or something. It depends on your country, obviously. I highly recommend it. It makes reading Latin so much more fun, and you can just, again, read unlimited amounts on your Kindle, and it's fantastic. And yeah, you'll have to learn how to use Caliber. And as I go through, I'll probably update this spreadsheet with EPUBs perhaps at one point, just for people who don't want to use Caliber or don't know how to. Then they can just download the EPUB and send it to their Kindle. Again, this isn't a tutorial on how to use Kindle, so I'm not going to talk too much more about it, but maybe at one point I will. I don't know, in a separate video. Though, again, I highly recommend getting a Kindle. It gives you kind of all the niceties of reading it on a piece of paper, but it means you don't have to buy, again, dozens of these books, which is just not very practical. If you're taking like half a year to read a book, then yeah, it's fine. But if you're reading like a ton using mass input, it's just not really practical unless you have an awesome Latin library available to you somewhere. A Kindle is a very good investment, and I highly recommend it. I use it a ton for French, and I'm now using it for Latin, and I have to say it has made learning Latin and reading Latin so much more pleasurable. One annoying thing, though, I'll admit, is that macrons seem to mess up the dictionary a little bit. And I also have another confession to make. I think I prefer to read Latin without macrons. I realize that's kind of sacrilege, and I'm not saying people should not include macrons in their published work, but for me personally, reading on my Kindle, I think I prefer not to have the macrons. I just find it a more pleasurable experience. And hypothetically speaking, if you listen to enough Latin, you should be able to acquire these macrons, not the macrons, but the long vowels and the difference between short vowels. If you read and listen to enough Latin, hypothetically, you should be able to acquire them and not worry so much about have to see them on the page every single time. I realize that is controversial opinion, and I do encourage people obviously to care about long vowels and to publish things with macrons and stuff, but I personally prefer not to have them on the Kindle. Anyways, so yeah, get a Kindle. Makes Latin a lot more fun. All right, moving on. So Gesta Francorum, also great. This is a first-hand testimony of the First Crusade and attacking, I think, Jerusalem, I believe, among other towns. And it's great, not very hard. I enjoyed it a lot. It didn't take me very long to read. Not very much in terms of vocabulary I didn't know, which is cool. It's a very bloody account, which I guess is probably accurate for the time. I mean, there's like one part where they're talking about the streets of one of the cities being full of bodies and the blood turning the river red and stacking the bodies like firewood or something. It's pretty gruesome, and often the writer or the person whose perspective the history is from, they don't seem particularly distraught by it. They're just like, yep, these are Turks or whoever they're fighting at the time, and they're all dead. And I mean, yeah, so be warned, it's a very bloody, very violent history, obviously about the Crusades, which is very violent and bloody, but it's a very good read. Now this one is where the picture was from that I showed you at the very beginning, Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis. And it's about monks that go on this voyage, basically. I forget the reason why they went on the voyage, and they went from island to island and various adventures that happened. And not the easiest to read, I'll admit. Very, very entertaining. And there was lots I understood, but lots I was a little confused on, where it was very fuzzy. There was one part where someone was giving a sermon on the boat, and there was like fishes and creatures swimming in the water, basically still, as they were like almost listening to the sermon. At least that's the way I interpreted it. And yeah, it was a good read. Like I said, it was a mixture. Sometimes it read pretty easily. Sometimes there were whole sections I was pretty confused on. So good read, though, overall. Now, Legenda, Aurea, and Disciplina Clericalis are, again, more collections of stories. They were talked about in a primer medieval Latin, so that's how I heard about them. Legenda Aurea are stories about famous saints, and Disciplina Clericalis are, again, just collection of stories. I think some of them are from not just like Rome or Christian countries, but from around the world as well. But again, mixture of difficulties. Sometimes I found that as I go through it, once I got like about the 3/4 mark, I found to start to click into the style and the vocabulary they would use. But again, I mostly just went through them and read through them slowly or not slowly, just fluidly, and try my best with them. And again, little by little, I started to understand more and more. And that's what I expect to happen as I go through these, that the more I read, the better I get. Now, I have 2 translations that are interesting. I was curious in checking them out. Regulus, which is a Latin translation of The Little Prince, and Alicia in Terra Mirabili, which is a translation of Alice in Wonderland. And it feels weird, to be honest, reading these, I'll admit, because it almost feels like fake Latin, if I'm going to be honest. And that's obviously a little weird thing to say, like, how is this any more fake than any other Latin? And any of this strangeness, is it any more strange than medieval Latin or Renaissance Latin? Like, probably not. But I don't know. It feels weird because it's like, it's not historical. Like, it doesn't matter if I read this. It's not historically relevant. So, like, why am I reading this, basically? I don't know. It's a weird thing. But they're fun. They're entertaining. And I know these stories decently well. The Little Prince was the first book I ever read in French, and it's actually not that easy of a book, and it's not a great first book. It's pretty short, but it's a very strange story with lots of weird vocabulary, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as someone's first book in French, although it's very, very common for people's first book in French. But it was a lot of fun to read, and I enjoyed it. And same thing with Alicia in Terra Mirabili. Also seemed like a pretty good translation. It was entertaining, at least. A lot of vocabulary I didn't know, though, in that one as well. That made it challenging. Both of these two, though, I would say the grammar and the syntax wasn't very hard. It's actually really simple for the most part, but the vocabulary was very expansive, and so that was the main challenge. So I try my best with them. Went through them because I know Little Prince, obviously, the story really well. It wasn't too hard. Alice in Wonderland slightly less, although I've seen many versions of it, and I'm sure I've read it at least once. But some parts were easier than others, but it was overall fun. Now, this one, De Auduno Westifiordensi. And I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. It's a translation of, it's like a short story from ancient Norse, I believe, or Old Norse into Latin. And it was all right. Yeah, I would say it was fine. A little bit harder, I guess, at parts. It's pretty short as well. But for whatever reason, I don't really like translations in general. Even these historical translations, I just find them kind of a drag to read. Even the Vulgate, to some extent. Because and I never liked reading translations in French either. I liked to have it when it was originally it was composed originally in that language. It just feels weird. It just feels like it's sort of I don't know, it doesn't feel the same. And it was a good story. I enjoyed it. And I don't really remember the plot very well, to be honest. It was about this voyage, and I think it was a cow he was supposed to deliver to this king, and there were some problems along the way. And it was good. I just don't really like translations when learning a second language. So I realize that it's kind of an outlier to me. I mean, again, I'm probably going to read these rest of these translations. I have Winnie the Pooh, Robinson Crusoe, Wizard of Oz, and Harry Potter and stuff. And I will probably read them, but it just feels a little bit different. It doesn't feel the same way as authentic, actual historical Latin, but maybe that makes me weird. I'm not sure. And yeah, I'm not sure if I talked about these ones. These ones were linked on Reddit by Raphael. Passio Sanctarum Perpetuae et Felicitatis, and de pari aut impari evae aque adae peccato. Not the easiest reading, I'll admit, especially this one, which is about someone who was a Christian who was in jail and waiting to go to the gladiator fight to be killed. And it was interesting. Some parts were easier than others. Sometimes the vocabulary was very descriptive with lots of adjectives and stuff that I just didn't know. So that was tough, but there were other parts I could understand very, very well. There was a part where I think she talked about a vision she had about going to heaven, and there was like angels and opening the gates or something. I forget the details, but it was very readable. So definitely recommend it. Just it wasn't the easiest reading. And this one talks about whether or not Eve in the Garden of Eden is guilty for all the sins of humanity, essentially, and talking about how it wasn't really Eve's fault and stuff. It was sort of a philosophical debate she was having. And it was interesting. Again, if you haven't read the Genesis and Exodus and stuff, as well as the New Testament, at least the Gospels, I feel like this stuff would be kind of hard to read because it references a lot. So that's why doing your homework and reading the Bible is a good thing. Historia de Duobus Amantibus, which was recommended by, if you Google how to learn Latin, there's this one which really focuses on the input-based approaches and stuff. It's very intense. It has a black background with learning Latin. I'm sure you'll find it. He recommends this book. He describes it as quite easy, at least the style. I don't think it's that easy, mostly in terms of vocabulary. There was a lot of vocabulary I didn't know, and I found it pretty tough. I mean, not impossible. I got through it. I think I understood the plot okay, but it was pretty tough. That's why I kind of put it down this list a little bit. And probably the hardest thing I read so far is Historia Regum Brittaniae, which talks about the history of British kings. And it was very hard. I was mostly interested because they talk about King Arthur and Merlin. And there was one part where Merlin predicted that there were dragon eggs underneath Camelot and stuff. And it was cool. Anytime you talk about dragons, it's always cool. But especially I would say the second half I found very, very hard. Just a ton of vocabulary I didn't know. It was very hard. And sometimes it was confusing who is who and why people are doing things, but there was also lots of parts I did understand decently well, so it was a mixed bag. It was very hard. Like I said, hardest thing I've read in Latin, that's for sure, and I had very, very fuzzy understanding. I won't give it a percentage or anything, but it was very, very hard. And currently I'm reading De Imitatione Christi, which is a religious book about, I forget the expression, but it's talking about how to live your life as a Christian, among other things. It was written about 1500, and one of the most popular books in Europe at the time, one of the most translated books, and still is used by Catholics. It's still popular among Catholics as well. But yeah, it's a mixed bag. The vocabulary is actually not that bad. There's actually relatively few words I don't know, but I still find it very hard to read. Sometimes I'll read a sentence and I'll know every single word, but I just do not understand what is being communicated. And sometimes I'll feel like I'll read sentence after sentence, and it feels like I'm technically understanding each unit, but it's like how these ideas are stringing together, I'm just very confused. And it's possible it's just because, again, some of the ideas are not so easy to understand, and it's something you have to reflect on and study, and that's probably it. I don't know if it's the style, maybe. I don't know. It's hard, but I mean, there's lots I'm understanding. There's definitely lots that I'm enjoying about it. It's a bit of a slog, I'll admit, but also rewarding as well. And it's also very historically significant, so that's also why I want to read it. It's also fairly long too. I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book, but yeah, I'm not sure. It might be one of those things that unless you're a trooper, you might want to skip perhaps. I'll probably include it still, but because of its historical significance, but it's a little challenging. Again, not in terms of vocabulary, it really isn't, but it's just the style I find, and maybe the ideas themselves very, very hard. Okay, now the rest of these are things that were suggested by Raphael, among other people, and just things that I found elsewhere. And so this one is a novel or a novella that was, I think, in the Renaissance, I believe it came out, or maybe it was even Neo-Latin, I'm not sure. This one talks a little bit, I think it's about the First Crusade. It's very, very long, but I've read that the style is very simple and the vocabulary is relatively constrained. So even if it's very long, it might be a good read because it might be just a ton of reading. And if it's relatively simple style, I feel like I learned quite a lot from it. It's a pretty big commitment though, 250,000 words. So we'll see. If I'm reading maybe I'll read the first few books, maybe first 50,000 words. And if I feel like I'm not really into it, maybe I'll cut it short there. And then this one, Historia Francorum, which is about the kings of France, I believe, or the king of the Franks. Not as long as the other one, but still pretty long. But again, I've heard that the style and stuff, it's very historically significant, and the style is not too bad and relatively restrained. So we'll see. I'll try it out. This one's not nearly as big a commitment, so maybe I'll power through that. Another one that's quite long is Gesta Danorum, which is Gesta Danorum, my pronunciation. It is a collection of stories from Denmark, and there are a lot of historically significant stories. Very famously, there's one story with the archer and the apple on top of the head. I think Daniel Pedersen, he used one of those stories as inspiration for one of his beginner stories. And there's also a precursor to Hamlet, one of the original stories that I don't think Shakespeare read Gesta Danorum and then was like, I'm going to write Hamlet. But I think stories that one of these stories influenced, he read and then used that as a basis to write Hamlet. So it's very significant that way. It's quite long though, and I've heard based on Daniel Pedersen's article he wrote on Latinitium, it has some pretty poetic language. It's prose, but most of it's prose, but it uses language that it's more like Silver Age Latin. It's very poetic rather than classical Latin, which is very constrained and very like, we're just going to be logical and not use too much poetic language unless we're writing poetry. I don't know if that's at all a fair characterization of classical versus Silver Age, Golden Age versus Silver Age Latin. But anyways, I've heard it, he described it as very idiosyncratic Latin. But I mean, I read a lot of pretty idiosyncratic medieval Latin at this point, so maybe it won't seem too bad. But we'll see. Again, pretty long, so we'll see if I actually commit to the whole thing, but it looked interesting. And then this one was a novel that I think it's a science fiction-y adventure novel from Renaissance or Neo-Latin that I like to check out. It might be really hard, but we'll see. And then there's, of course, Confessiones, which is, who wrote that? St. Augustine. And that's his very famous autobiography about his faith and stuff, which again, it's very historically significant. He's considered a very good writer, so it seemed like a good thing to read. Again, long but not insurmountable length, and it's helpful that I've read all this other Christian literature, and hopefully will give me enough of a knowledge base and reading base to be able to understand at least it to some extent, but we'll see. And Historia Calamitatum, I don't remember who wrote this, but the reason I put it on it was that I think it has a very similar style to Confessiones, so we'll see. If it's not very long, so it's not a huge commitment. And then, of course, we have Winnie the Pooh, Robinson Crusoe, Wizard of Oz, which 70,000 words translation. Again, it's fake Latin, but it'll be fun, and it's always good to switch things up. I mean, if you're only reading like Christian literature, for example, it can be a bit monotonous, and if you're only reading histories, it can be quite monotonous. So switching things up is not a bad thing, even if it's not perfect Latin, or maybe it's a little Englishy or something. I don't have The Hobbit on here because everyone says it's terrible Latin, but these other things, people generally have good things to say about them, or at least they're good enough where it's not going to harm your Latin too much. And then, of course, I have these fairy tales by Avellanus and Harry Potter, which I think I've talked about in previous videos. So yeah, so it's quite a lot of reading still. I'm not sure how much. Let's find out how much reading I have to do to finish stage 4. So it's 914,000 words, which is quite a lot. So if I read 10,000 words a day, I can finish that in 3 months. So we'll see if I get through it. But then I'm pretty sure if I read all of it, I'll be in a very good place to read classical Latin, or at least I hope so. And now in terms of the classical Latin, it's a little skimpy, I'll admit, but there's some significant stuff in here. A lot of the things I've added, basically, I kind of condensed it a little just to make it a little bit clearer. I added Caesar's thing about the Civil War, which I figure like if you're reading Caesar, why not just read all of it? It's not that much. So just stick with the same author, get used to the style, improve even more. And I added some things that are considered like beginner classical Latin, or things that are at least approachable at the beginning. Pliny the Miner's Letters. It's only 66,000 words, and it's considered approachable. A couple of things, 3 things from Caesar that are significant and considered not terribly hard. I don't know. We'll find out. And then Seneca's letters as well, which is quite a lot of reading. But so again, it's very rough. Like I don't even really know if this is a good order, but it's reasonable. And yeah, so that's basically the reading plan. So it's obviously a lot of reading to go, but I figure again, I'm trying to read. My goal is about 10,000 words a day, sometimes even more. But if I read 10,000 words a day, I can finish all of stage 4 by the next 3 months, which is probably when I'll make another video. And then hopefully I'll be ready to tackle classical Latin and really go into it and really dive in. It's not to say that I don't want to read more medieval Latin or Renaissance and stuff. And there are definitely significant authors I have not included here, like Erasmus, for example, St. Augustine, or there's other Christian authors that are significant that I haven't as well, and medieval authors as well that I'm aware of. But again, it's not going to be perfect, and this is mostly used just to have enough reading to get me up to a decent level, and then I can tackle classical Latin. And then I'm sure at one point I'll go back and read more late Latin, medieval Latin, Neo-Latin, Renaissance Latin, and yeah. But obviously I want to read Romans too, and these things seem a reasonable thing to go with. Cool. So the question is, though, how good am I at Latin at this point after 1 year? I don't know, but let's find out. So I pulled up, so I went to our lovely Latin library, which I've been using. But let's take a look at some random bits that I have not actually read yet. So I could go back and read something that I've already read, and that wouldn't be a very fair way of testing my ability. So it's better to have something that I haven't seen before, or maybe like looked at briefly and see how well I do. Okay, so let's take a look. So I pulled up here. Let's do a little Livy too. Okay, so we have Eutropius. Test me with just classical Latin, because that's what people mostly care about, I guess. We got Eutropius, Caesar, Livy, and Cicero. And I'll read a little selection or a little excerpt. Maybe you can hear how I pronounce things, and we'll see how my pronunciation is. This is a little time capsule of my ability. And then I'll, I guess, talk about what I think the passage means, and we'll go from there. All right, so it looks like I clicked on book 7, so let's not click on that. Let's do something at random. Maybe book 4. I have no idea what this is about. Let's find out. All right. Oh, it looks like it's about the Punic War. So let's read the first sentence. Transacto punico bello secutums Macedonicum contra Philippum regum quinquagesimo et primo anno ab urbe condita. Tiberius, forget what that is, Quintius Flaminius adversum Philippum missus rem prospere gessit. Pax ei data est his legibus. Ne Graecia civitatibus, quas Romani contra eum defenderunt, bellum inferet, ut captivos et transfugas rederet, quinquaginta solas naves haberet, reliquas Romanis dederet, per annos decem quaterna milia pondo argenti praestaret, et obsidem daret filium sum Demetrium. Tiberius Quintus etiam Lacedaemonis intulit bellum. Ducum eorum napidem vicit, et quibus voluit conditionibus infidem accepit. Ingenti gloria triumphavit? Is it triumphavit? Duxit antiquorum nobilissimum obsides. Demetrium, Philippi, Filium, et Armenum nabilis. So that was my bad pronunciation. Let's go through it. All right. So we got, I'll just read it and then I'll talk about what I think it means. All right. So this one's talking about the Punic War, Carthage, but anyways, it's Punic War secutums. I'm not entirely sure what that means. But then we have Macedonicum contra Philippum regum. And so it's talking about who this person is against this person. And then there's a bunch of numbers, which I'm a little bit fuzzy on. And then it's from ab urbe condita, the founding of Rome. I'm sure they're big numbers, which is why I can't recognize it. Anyways, so I'm assuming those are countries that they're talking about. Let's look at the next part. This name, I forget, Tiberius, I think. Quintius Flaminus adversum Philippum missus rem prospere gessit. Now, talking about this person is against this person, and I don't really know what this means, prospere gessit. So gessit obviously means to manage and stuff. It's like I understand the words, but I'm not exactly sure the meaning. And then this one, pax ei data est his legibus. So, it's obviously talking about peace being given, and legibus, I imagine that's the law. And then we have ne Graecia civitatibus. Let's read it. We're talking about the Greek citizens who Rome defending against. They started the war. They would have prisoners, I guess, returned. And then they talk about quinquaginta, it's a big number, I don't know. Solas? I'm not sure the significance of that in this case. Boats have it. A big number of boats they have. Oh, I see. So they're talking about a certain number of boats that they would only have, and then the rest they would give back to Rome. So I guess these are the conditions of peace, which is like essentially because of they lost the war, I'm assuming. And then, okay, so they have to pay a lot of money for a certain period of time, and they have to give as hostage this guy, Demetrium. They talk about this person bringing war, and then, maybe, yeah, I'm not sure. Was this like, they talk about they're still fighting the war. Was this like a condition of peace, perhaps? I'm not sure. And then Nabidum, the sort of a military leader, won or was defeated, I guess. Oh yeah, so their ducem, their leader was defeated, and they wanted the conditions of peace. They accepted it. I'm pretty sure this would be triumphavit, not triumphavit. That's probably a tempo. So great victory, great triumph. Oh, he was led in front of the hostages. I assume this is like they go down the road and the defeated people are being led in the big triumph, like the slaves or whatever in chains and bringing all the treasure down forget the name of the big road. So that was a very awkward. I think I mostly understood it. Again, I'm not really used to Eutropius's style, and I'm not saying it's complicated or anything, but that was the best I could do. All right, Caesar, let's choose a random book. I've kind of peeked at all these books at one point or another, so I'll just do 2, I guess, and then I'll flip down a little bit, down maybe halfway. So let's do this one. It's a little bit. Maybe I'll just read a sentence, so it won't take too long. Let's do this. Let's do this part. Okay, so again, a lot of the readers, they kind of sort of assume Caesar will be one of the first things you read. And so it's possible this is kind of cheating, but we'll see. I haven't really read Caesar at all, so it's still going to be very hard. Let's find out. So I'll read it, and then I'll talk about what I think it means. Postridie eus Dei Caesar, prius quam se hostes exterore ac fuga reciperent, infine sues sonum, qui proximi remis erant, exercitum duxit, et magno itinere confecto et opinum noviodunum contendit. Okay, so this one seems a little more approachable than the Eutropius one. Maybe I'm just used to the style, so let's go through it. Okay, so the next day, so the next of that day, Caesar, before, so this phrase, before, I feel like it's saying that before the enemies are terrified and run away. I don't really understand why it expresses that, but that would make sense based on the context. Then he talks about going to the border of the territory, which is close to, I'm assuming Remis is a town or place. And then he led his army, and then after the big journey was completed, they went to the town of Novidunum, and Contendit, of course, is going there. So not too bad, I would say. There's just this part that was, again, a little bit confused by, but not too bad. And again, maybe I got lucky and that was an easy one. I'm not sure. All right, Livy, let's just choose a random one. How about, let's see, 21. Let's find out. Okay, so again, I won't do the full thing. Let's just do a sentence. Oh, this one's about Hannibal. That's fun. Okay, it's always a good time. Carthage. All right, I'll read it out loud and then I'll talk about what I think it means. In parte operis mei licet mihi praefari, quod in principio summae totius professi prerique sunt rerum scriptores, bellum maxime omnium memorabili, quae unquam gesta sint me scripturum, quod Hannibali duce Carthaginienses cum populo Romano gessere. All right, cool. So this one actually doesn't seem too bad. So let's take a look. In parte operis mei licet mihi praefari. So he's kind of talking about if I could be permitted to preface, I guess, his work. Let's see. Quod in principio summae totius professi plerique sunt rerum scriptores. I find that phrase a little confusing. Like I said, I understand all the words, I think, but it's not, and I vaguely know what he's talking about, but I couldn't really tell you exactly. The next part, I don't think is too hard. So the biggest war of the people ever remember, or has ever been raged that I've ever ridden, something like that. When Hannibal, the leader of Carthage, waged war against the people of Rome. Again, there's that part in the middle. I'm a little confused exactly what it's expressing. Again, it's one of those things where I recognize all the words. I just don't exactly know how it all fits together. And I'm sure my translation off the cuff is probably pretty bad, but I think I understand it okay, like what it's expressing. I'm sure it's a little bit, sometimes these prefaces or these prologues are often the hardest part of these works. I noticed that with some of the other histories I read, the medieval stuff. So this one's a little bit challenging. Cool. But again, not too bad though. Perhaps, maybe I just got lucky with that one. All right, let's do a Cicero, Cicero. I don't know which one to pick though. Should I do a speech? Maybe something on his philosophy? Let's do, I could do a letter. I could do one of his speeches. Let's do a letter, and let's just do something at random 7. This might even be harder than the speeches, but we're here now, so let's find out. All right, So it looks like we have a long sentence. Well, it's one of those long sentences, I guess. Yeah, I'm not reading all that. Let's see. Let's go to the semicolon at least. All right. Si te dolor aliqui corporis aut infirmitas valitudinis tuae tenuit, quo minus aludos venires, fortunae magis tribio quam sapientiae tuae. Cool. All right, this one seems a little harder. Let's see what it means. So so it seems to be talking about pain or injury in the body that they're kind of suffering from, if this is a thing, and they have to go to the gym or the exercise area less. Then he talks about fortune that he's wishing him, I guess, rather than his wisdom. I don't know. It's a little confusing. Again, it's one of those things where I probably would need to read more Cicero to actually understand him, because I recognize pretty much all the words. I don't know if there's any words I don't really know, but it doesn't really quite click yet. But again, it's one of those things where I just need to read more, and I'm sure I would get used to it eventually. So anyways, hopefully I haven't embarrassed myself too much. So clearly I have a lot of work to do still, and especially I haven't really read that much classical Latin, so I'm not really used to these authors yet. It's funny how Eutropius was like the weirdest one, and maybe the fact that it's late Latin that might influence it a little bit. It's a little less perhaps standard. I don't really know. If anything, so Caesar was probably the easiest. Livy wasn't too bad, although a little bit confusing. Cicero, probably the hardest, actually, of all these, even though, again, not very many words I don't know, but just a little bit of how it fits together is a little bit confusing. Okay, so I've talked about that, talked about my level. Anki I'm kind of doing. I'm not really adding too many words right now to Anki. I'm mostly just trying to do them when I can every day, but sometimes I forget. I made about almost 3,000 total flashcards, but I'm mostly just focusing on developing my reading ability and not so much about making flashcards and memorizing things. But maybe when my reading ability gets a little bit better and it's really just about vocabulary, maybe I'll start doing that. I'm not sure. All right, I think I've talked enough. Basically, in terms of my plan, I would like to finish stage 4 in the next 3 months. It's a lot of reading, and it's possible I might skip some things, so I don't know. But my goal, I'm going to keep on going. It's a year's done. Once in a while, I go back to French and kind of miss learning a modern language, because I feel like I'm talking to dead people from hundreds or thousands of years ago as my language learning, which is cool. And obviously, there's more modern language there, or there's the spoken Latin movement, of course, that I could be involved with, I suppose. But in general, it feels like a lot of this reading is communicating with people many hundreds and thousands of years in the past. And that's cool, but I do sometimes miss a modern language, and watching YouTube or movies and TV shows and talking to native speakers and stuff, none of which you can really do in Latin. But I don't think even though I have barely touched French in the last year, I don't think my French has diminished that much. It's definitely become a little less sharp, I'll admit, and the amount of effort it takes to read and listen is more. But I think the amount of attrition I've had, it's been relatively minimal, which is great to see. Even my speaking is okay. Like, a lot of the acquired pronunciation is just still in my brain. And I feel like with a month of going back to French, I feel like I could get pretty much back to where I was. I'm pretty sure. Like, read a couple books and watch 100 hours of YouTube and podcasts. I think I'd be back to where I was. So I'm not really worried about it. Again, I do kind of miss French, and at one point I do want to go back and really get it to the next level. But right now I'm just focusing on Latin, trying to get it as good as I can. Spend the next 3 months getting to stage 5, and then I'm going all in on classical Latin and trying to get it up to as best I can. And so maybe in 3 months I'll have another 1 million words read, or close to it. I'll have doubled my ability, perhaps. I'm not really sure. And then we'll see how we're doing. Again, any questions, let me know. Spreadsheets of what I'm doing will be in the description. And all right, that's it. Have a good one. Bye.